Hello and welcome to betaYouth. Today's terrible topical joke. Why didn't the newly elected American president claim his victory until he was absolutely certain? Well, he was biding his time. I have to admit to being a Trekkie. I'm a big fan of Star Trek. There have been various men and women as captains of the Starship Enterprise down the years, but did you know they all have one thing in common? They all have 3 ears. They have their left ear, their right ear, and space, the final frontier. My jokes don't get any better, do they? Anyway, our theme today is called New Frontiers. This can be many things, but I'd ask you to think of it as being prepared to try things out of your comfort zone. Things that are not normal for you, and things that you may not expect to ever find yourself doing. When I lived in Hastings in East Sussex 5 years ago, I went to a wonderful church called King's, which was based in an old indoor cricket centre rather than a normal church building. The congregation was over 1,000 every Sunday. There was always so much going on, as well as an amazing youth group. However, King's Church started in 1977 with 4 people meeting in a basement flat because they felt God was asking them to do something different. Coincidentally, King's is now part of a big group of churches called New Frontiers, and I can't think of a more appropriate name. Okay, so our reading is from Acts chapter 10. The next day, as the 3 travellers were approaching the town, Peter went out on the balcony to pray. It was about noon. Peter got hungry and started thinking about lunch. While lunch was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the skies open up. Something that looked like a huge blanket, lowered by ropes at its 4 corners, settled on the ground. Every kind of animal and reptile and bird you could think of was on it. Then a voice came. "Go to it, Peter. Kill and eat." Peter said, "Oh no, Lord. I've never so much as tasted food that was not kosher." The voice came a second time. "If God says it's okay, it's okay." This happened 3 times, and then the blanket was pulled back up into the skies. As Peter, puzzled, sat there trying to figure out what it all meant, the men sent by Cornelius showed up at Simon's front door. They called in, asking if there was a Simon, also called Peter, staying there. Peter, lost in thought, didn't hear them, so the Spirit whispered to him, "3 men are knocking at the door looking for you. Get down there and go with them. Don't ask any questions. I sent them to get you." Peter went down and said to the men, "I think I'm the man you're looking for. What's up?" They said, "Captain Cornelius, a God-fearing man well known for his fair play, ask any Jew in this part of the country, was commanded by a holy angel to get out and bring you to his house so he could hear what you had to say." Peter invited them in and made them feel at home. Love this again. Great story. The Bible's full of them. First, note that Peter makes prayer a key part of his everyday life. He didn't make a big deal of it. It's just what he does, talking to God. Prayer is really important, but it doesn't have to be all formal and righteous. In fact, I would say quite the opposite. It can just be a main part of our minute-by-minute living experience. This includes what I call arrow prayers, a quick, instinctive thought directed to God. Maybe an on-the-spot request, saying sorry for something, or just saying thanks or giving praise. We then see Peter getting hunger pangs and we all know what that feels like. We're also told of Peter falling into a trance, and we all know about daydreaming, if this is what it was, especially you guys as teenagers. Peter dreamt about a blanket with loads of different animals, including reptiles, birds, etc., on it being lowered from heaven. He is told to kill and eat. Many of you will be repelled by this thought. You may be vegetarian or vegan, or you may hate the idea of killing animals. I don't think for a moment that God meant this as an animal slaughter. Rather, he was making a point. Just like you may feel, Peter was also repelled by God's instruction. Notice that, unlike Philip a couple of weeks ago, Peter did argue with God at first. And there are reasons for this. Peter was a Jew, and Hebrew people have very strict rules about what animals may be eaten and how they're killed. You may know, or have heard in the reading, the term kosher. Jews through history and today will not touch food that is not kosher. You may also have heard about Islamic rules for food called halal, which is very similar to Jewish kosher. Both religions feel very strongly about pork, for example, and pigs would have been in this blanket, not pigs in the blanket which you might have at Christmas, the blanket that Peter saw, and eating pork would be against everything he'd always known, and he would find it completely repulsive. But God persists, saying, if God says it's okay, it's okay. You see, God had no intention of Peter having to kill animals at all. He was using this vision as a lesson or example to Peter regarding something else. Jewish history in the Old Testament taught Jews that they were special, as God's chosen people. Basically, they would have seen themselves as better than the rest of mankind. God had been with them for hundreds of years. He'd led them through the wilderness and settled them in Israel, the promised land. And God had given them laws to follow that set them above others. Please do not think this is still the case in modern times. Yes, the Jews are still God's chosen people, together with us Christians. And they are truly special, but I don't think they any longer see themselves as better than you or me. We had Remembrance last Sunday. One of the key reasons people fought and died in World War II was to overcome the evil Hitler and the Nazis created. This included massacring 6 million Jews, as well as millions of learning disabled, communists, homosexuals and others who were seen as different. If you can cope with graphic and terrible images, and if you're 15, and with parental permission, you might watch the movie Schindler's List. It could give you sleepless nights, as it did me, but it shows clearly what evil is, what the Jewish nation had to somehow cope with, and why they have reclaimed their promised land, and why so many brave people made the ultimate sacrifices to stop Hitler. Moving on though, you can see how challenging this would have been for Peter. But God was really saying that the good news of Jesus, his death and resurrection, and the hope of wonderful and eternal life was for everyone, not just the Jews. The very early church were exclusively Jewish, and this was a really big step to take to include non-Jews, known as Gentiles, in the Christian church. That's why it's called New Frontiers. But as always, God was at work, and he put steps in place that Peter had no awareness of yet. Earlier in Acts chapter 10, God had spoken to a man called Cornelius, a Roman soldier, a centurion in charge of 100 other soldiers. He was clearly an outstanding man. It says, he and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. God had told him to send messengers to meet Peter and ask him to come and see Cornelius. He was told the exact address, many, many miles away, and the time to find Peter. This was not where Peter lived. He was travelling and had only planned to stay one night. What did Peter's vision with the blanket of unclean animals mean? This is not God telling Peter to eat anything. He knows this is not about eating what the Jews call unclean food. Peter tells us that the vision means to call no person unclean, whatever their race, religion, background, or anything. In fact, the same principle should apply in modern times, especially in the Christian church. For example, Black Lives Matter. Black lives matter to Jesus. All lives matter to Jesus. Female or male, young or old, black or white or any colour, whatever sexuality, whatever religion, whatever race, in fact, whatever anything. I would go so far as to say that the three men responsible for more deaths than any other humans in history, all from the 20th century, Adolf Hitler, 30 million deaths, Joseph Stalin, leader of the USSR, modern Russia, 40 million deaths, Chairman Mao, leader of Communist China, 60 million deaths. These men could, and perhaps did, ask God's forgiveness for their sins before their deaths, accept God's free gift of forgiveness, and maybe now in heaven with the saints and very many of their victims. I hope I'm not being offensive and flippant saying this, and I think it's highly unlikely, but the point is that God's gift of life through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is there for all mankind. Anyway, Peter and Cornelius were the start of the church as we now know it, a fellowship of Christians across the whole world who are all greatly loved and equal in the eyes of God. Peter and Cornelius had to be brave. They had to step out of the normal and face new frontiers. God was asking them to go against expectations and tradition. Because they listened to God, who never forces himself or his wishes on anyone, they have created a route for billions over the last 2,000 years to open their hearts to God and find life in all its fullness, life as it's meant to be. I want to finish with a story from Alaska in the cold north of the American continent from over 120 years ago. Two men called Ed Jessen and Max Hirschfield were unsuccessfully trying to find gold in a place called Dawson City. News came that gold had been discovered in a place called Nome, which was 1,200 miles away. The problem was that the Alaskan winter had set in, and there was no way of getting to Nome. The roads and trails were completely snowed over, the snow was too intense for a dog team, and the rivers were frozen. These two enterprising and brave young men separately got their hands on bicycles, put the front wheels on a sled, and cycled along the Yukon and other rivers, 1,200 miles all the way to Nome, arriving before just about anyone else. In Nome, they were able to simply pick up gold nuggets off the beach that was being washed ashore. They didn't even have to dig, and they both became millionaires overnight. I don't know if they were Christians, and I don't know if anything other than desire for riches impelled them. I do know they were prepared to face a massive challenge, to do something completely different to what anyone had done before, to step into new frontiers. If these men were prepared to take on such an enormous adventure just to get money in this world, I would challenge you if you might be prepared to face new frontiers, whatever they may be for you, in order to achieve the ultimate prize, life shared with the God of love, both now in this world and across the universe and beyond for all eternity. If you're unclear on what this means, please do speak to someone you trust. Either way, please do think about what meaning and purpose there is and could be for your life, and what you may need to do about this. God bless you, now and always.